Bobby the Brain Heenan was one of the greatest minds in wrestling, but that doesn't mean he liked everyone he worked with. Behind the scenes, Heenan had serious problems with certain people. Some were reckless, some were arrogant, and others were just downright miserable to be around. Take Ole Anderson for example. Heenan worked under a lot of promoters during his career, but he absolutely despised Anderson. He was a tough, old-school wrestler and one of the most notoriously miserable men in the business. He was stubborn, abrasive, and hard to please. His attitude rubbed plenty of people the wrong way, and Heenan was no exception. Before Heenan became a star in the WWF, he spent time as a manager in Georgia Championship Wrestling, where Anderson was in charge. In 1979, Anderson convinced Heenan to leave the AWA, where he had been working, and move his family to Atlanta for a spot in Georgia Championship Wrestling. Heenan took the deal, assuming that it was a long-term proposition, but Anderson ended up firing him after less than a year. Bobby had uprooted his entire life based on what turned out to be an empty promise. He was furious and felt completely misled, but Anderson denied having ever guaranteed him anything, and Bobby had no other choice but to pack everything back up, including his family, and go back to the AWA. To say that he took it personally would be an understatement, and he never forgave Anderson for lying to his face. In interviews later in his life, he didn't hold back, calling Anderson a horrible, miserable man who had no respect for anyone. Anderson was known for his tough personality, but Bobby saw nothing redeeming about him whatsoever. Unlike other people that Heenan clashed with, there was no mutual respect here, and he never had a single nice thing to say about him. The Red Rooster might be one of the worst gimmicks in WWE history, and Bobby knew that from day one. Terry Taylor, the man behind the gimmick, had allegedly rubbed people the wrong way backstage in the WWF, with rumours suggesting he had a habit of sucking up to management and going behind the other boys' backs. And it's been speculated that Vince McMahon gave him the humiliating Red Rooster gimmick as a punishment. Whatever the reason, Taylor was soon strutting around the ring with a bright red mohawk, flapping his arms and making chicken noises. Of course, Heenan thought the gimmick was a complete joke, and not a very good one. But worse than that, he had to be involved himself. Heenan was expected to help him get over, but he knew there was no salvaging this disaster. But Heenan reportedly wasn't keen on him personally either. Heenan flat out said that he didn't like him, and he certainly wasn't a fan, and he accused Terry Taylor of lying to him when they were both working in WCW. When he was interviewed about this, Bobby wouldn't go into any more detail, but it seemed like he didn't want to have to revisit that moment in his career. Unlike most bad gimmicks, the Red Rooster wasn't just a disaster for Terry Taylor, it was a headache for Heenan too. Bobby worked with plenty of difficult wrestlers, but none frustrated him more than the Ultimate Warrior. Heenan had zero respect for Warrior as a performer, believing that he was just a bodybuilder in face paint and a self-obsessed idiot who didn't belong in the wrestling business. Bobby was a man who respected guys with genuine talent, but he thought that Warrior got handed success just because of the way he looked. He said that he didn't know how to wrestle and he refused to learn, and worst of all, he didn't care about the safety of the people he worked with. And by all accounts, the feeling was mutual, because Jim Hellwig had no time for Bobby either. He was very sensitive to being criticised, and Bobby sometimes had a big mouth, but Warrior's reckless attitude in the ring became a real problem for Heenan at WrestleMania 5 when he was managing Rick Rude. It was Rude versus Warrior, and Heenan had a bad neck going into the match. It was a common sight to see Bobby getting involved physically in matches as a way to maximise heat, but on this night, he didn't want to be touched. So before the match, he told Warrior not to touch him because he didn't want to make the injury any worse, but Warrior decided to ignore him completely. Suffice to say, Bobby came backstage with a worse neck than he went in with, and he was seriously pissed off about it. When he confronted Warrior, he just brushed it off, showing zero remorse for what he'd done. It only reinforced what Heenan already thought, that Warrior was reckless, careless, and had no idea how to protect the people he was working with. And the worst of it came years later, when Bobby was battling throat cancer. While most of the wrestling world showed him support during this time, Warrior made some reprehensible comments, saying that Heenan's illness was karmic retribution. Not even Vince could come up with a better finish than this. Karma is just a beautiful thing to behold. Aside from being the best manager in the business, Bobby was also a fantastic colour commentator. He worked with plenty of commentary partners throughout his career, but Tony Schiavone was one that he never liked. Unlike his chemistry with Gorilla Monsoon or even Vince McMahon, he found Tony difficult to click with, and there were moments where that frustration boiled over on live TV. In 1999, during the uncensored pay-per-view, while Tony was addressing the audience, he noticed Bobby looking away and he snapped at him to face the camera. It was an awkward moment and a glimpse into the real tension between the two men that had been building up for years. Bobby refused to comply and instead turned his back to the camera, making it clear that he wasn't going to be bossed around. However, the biggest issue in their relationship came in 1999 when Gorilla Monsoon passed away. Heenan wanted to pay tribute to his friend, but Tony allegedly shut the idea down because Monsoon had never worked for WCW. In the end, Bobby was allowed to say a quick tribute on air, but he was furious over how it was handled. And then came the final betrayal. When WCW fired Bobby in 2000, Tony was told by management not to call him, so he didn't bother, and Bobby saw that as a cowardly move, and it was the last straw. In a radio interview after he'd been fired, he publicly trashed Tony on air, calling him a pig and mocking his announcing abilities. Heenan worked with plenty of unpredictable wrestlers during his career, but nothing prepared him for Brian Pillman. While Bobby usually had great control over his on-air persona, that changed in 1996 during a Clash of the Champions show. Pillman was fully immersed in his crazed, loose cannon persona at the time, and he stormed over to the commentary desk and grabbed Heenan by the neck. What Pillman didn't know, or at least didn't think about, was that Heenan still had that serious neck problem from years before. Instinctively, Heenan panicked and shouted an expletive live on air before storming off commentary. Backstage, Brian apologised immediately when he realised what he'd done, and Bobby didn't hold a grudge about that. But in that moment, you just know that he wasn't a fan of Brian Pillman's work whatsoever. When Bobby first jumped to WCW in 1994, it should have been an easy transition for him. Ted Turner was throwing millions of dollars at the company, and big-name superstars were signing up left and right. WCW was finally starting to look like real competition to the WWF. But behind the scenes, Heenan quickly realised that it wasn't being run like a professional company at all, and he blamed Eric Bischoff for all of the chaos. He had zero respect for Bischoff's leadership. To him, Eric was just a guy with Ted Turner's money who got lucky with the NWO angle. Unlike Vince McMahon, who put his own fortune on the line to build the WWF, Bischoff had the luxury of burning someone else's cash. Bobby thought that he didn't have a wrestling mind, he wasn't a promoter, he was just a corporate guy who fell into the right job at the right time. and that lack of real leadership was obvious every week on WCW television. Heenan became incredibly frustrated because he would commentate on shows and never receive any feedback from Bischoff as to what kind of job he was doing. Bobby had one of the greatest minds in the business, and being nicknamed the Brain wasn't just a gimmick, it played on his actual intelligence. He knew wrestling inside out, so he tried pitching some of his own ideas to Bischoff backstage. But Bischoff dismissed him immediately, telling him to keep his ideas to himself because he was just an announcer and not a writer. For Bobby, this was a breaking point, and he just stopped caring about his work. He still did his job and called the shows, but he knew that Bischoff didn't value his experience, and there was no point in doing any more than just the bare minimum. To Bobby, WCW's success in the mid-90s was pure luck, and Eric Bischoff was certainly no Vince McMahon. No doubt that Bobby made millions of dollars from WCW, and yet it was the one place that killed his love for professional wrestling.